Welcome dear students. Today our topic of deliberation is origin of agriculture, the dynamics of domestication. The transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer was a gradual one that took thousands of years. The earliest grains and legumes were not domesticated until about 10,000 years ago, and it took another 5,000 years for the rest of our major crops to emerge. The earliest groups of domesticants were all herbaceous annual species, and most were selfing, which provided quick harvests after planting and true to type seed. Once plants were domesticated, they were dramatically altered by humans through conscious and unconscious selection. The simple act of harvesting resulted in the selection of non-shattering traits, more determinate growth, more uniform ripening, and higher seed production. The seedling competition that occurred after seeds were scattered probably increased seedling vigor and rate of germination. Many of the traits associated with plant domestication are regulated by only a few genes, making rapid evolutionary change possible. Domestication often resulted in reduced levels of variability, but hybridization between crops and their wild progenitors occasionally increased their local adaptations and expanded their geographical range. Transfers of genes between wild and domesticated populations also led to the evolution of weeds that mimic the crop in such a way that their removal becomes difficult. The sudden scattered appearance of agriculture all across the globe suggests that farming was an important step in the evolving culture of human beings. A question that has intrigued anthropologists and ethnobotanists alike is why it took so long for farming to emerge. It seems likely that people had the wherewithal to farm long before they actually began doing it. Our ancestors surely gained considerable knowledge about plants and animals through the very acts of hunting and gathering. They had observed seasonal patterns of plant development and animal migrations and noticed seeds germinating and growing on their dump heaps. Our antecedents burned fields to drive game and must have noticed the subsequent plant regenerations. They had developed an intimate knowledge of how countless plant species could be used for food and medicine and knew how to detoxify otherwise poisonous food sources. Probably the oldest formal idea about why humans began cultivation is Child's oasis theory. He suggested that after glaciation, North Africa and Southwest Asia became drier and humans began to aggregate in areas where there was water. People first learned how to domesticate the animals that congregated around them, and then as human populations grew, they learned how to raise crops to avoid starvation. While this theory is an appealing explanation for agriculture at xeric sites, it is now known that mesic areas in Southeast Asia and tropical South America also spawned agriculture. In addition, the climate may not have been as harsh as Childs imagined. Evidence suggests that even the dry Zagros Mountains of the Near East may have been shifting from a cool steppe to a warmer and perhaps moisture savanna when agriculture was beginning in that area. Sauer suggested that farming first arose among the fishermen in Southeast Asia. They had a dependable food source, were sedentary and therefore had the time and strength to experiment with new food production systems. Again, this theory works well in areas where fish and crustaceans were readily available, but it does not explain the origin of agriculture in dry places without seafood, such as Mesoamerica and Central Africa. In addition, there is evidence that not all fishing people took up agriculture readily, as the Natufian fishing people of the Near East were among the last to take up agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, even though they actively gathered wild plant material. Many anthropologists have related population growth with the rise of agriculture. It is thought that as populations grew, food requirements rose to the point where alternative sources were needed to supply adequate resources. Cities are thought to have been possible because of agriculture, and the subsequent growth of populations led to specialization in jobs and the need for a farming class. While this theory holds great appeal, it is difficult to eliminate the possibility that population growth was often stimulated by the advent of agriculture rather than the reverse. There is also evidence that quite large cities could arise with only the most rudimentarily developed agriculture. Binford and Flannery's marginal zone hypothesis suggests sedentary fishermen turned to farming due to population pressure and competition. Alternatively, agriculture could have emerged from religious practices such as ritualistic plant gathering and animal domestication for sacrifice. The delay in adopting farming likely stemmed from the comfort and abundance of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Again, this theory is plausible for many locations, but not all agricultural people have fishing ancestors. There are suggestions that agriculture arose as a byproduct of religious ceremony. Plants providing ritualistic drugs were gathered and perhaps grown. Seeds may have been scattered on burial mounds. Animals could have been domesticated for sacrifice, while religion would have been a strong impetus for Neolithic peoples to apply what they knew about the life cycles of plants and animals. We are still left with our original question of why it took so long for people to begin the farming process. The simple answer to why it took us so long to begin farming is probably that hunting and gathering was a very comfortable way of life, and humans had to have a very good reason to give it up. Juliet Clutton Brock states that with the abundance of food and excellent raw materials of wood, bone, flint, and antler, it is difficult to see what the Mesolithic people of Europe lacked. Even casual gardeners know that farming is hard work, and early crop production must have been just as subject to the vagaries of nature as gathering, particularly before the advent of irrigation. Paleolithic people were adaptable and not solely nomadic. Sauer proposed they were sedentary when possible. Their transition to farming was driven by various factors like population growth, climate shifts, and resource scarcity. Cultivating plants served diverse needs beyond food, including ceremonial and practical purposes. Dear students, let us now talk about evolution of farming. The shift from the hunter-gatherer strategy to farming probably occurred in stages. For millions of years, our ancestors subsisted on the bounty provided by our natural environment. Our earliest upright ancestors may not have had a particularly orderly approach to finding food, but by the time of Homo erectus, hominids were surely collectors who planned the use of resources whose locations was known and monitored. By the time Cro-Magnon appeared, Homo sapiens must have had considerable knowledge about how plants and animals developed and were returning to the same areas year after year to harvest and hunt dependable sources. This probably led to significant changes in the plant populations. Once Cro-Magnon was returning regularly to the same spot, it may not have taken them long to become cultivators who enhanced the productivity of native fields by weeding, pruning, and burning. They probably began tilling with a digging stick or hoe to reduce competition and encourage germination. Early humans may have noticed soil turning improved crop yields, especially evident in plants like sunflowers. Cro-Magnon eventually transitioned to agriculture, starting with small gardens near homes. Edgar Anderson suggested waste dumps as an inspiration for planting. As farming evolved, humans likely began consciously selecting superior plant varieties. During the early stages of domestication process, Homo sapiens may not have been consciously selecting superior plant types, but it would not have taken us long to become domesticators who saved seeds and clonal material of superior types for replanting. Dear students, let's now talk about early stages of plant domestication. Evidence for plant domestication comes from a variety of sources, including: first, carbonized remains formed by high temperature baking under low oxygen; second, impressions pressed into pottery and bricks; third, parched plant remains produced under extreme dry conditions; fourth, plant material sunk in peat bogs or mud under anaerobic conditions; fifth, impregnations of metal oxides; sixth, mineralization where cell cavities are replaced by minerals such as silica, that is phytoliths; and finally, seventh, fecal remains. Evidence of domestication includes seed size increase, fruit coat thinning, and loss of dispersal organs. Artifacts like sickles and grinding wheels provide dietary insights. Traditional soil screening risks losing valuable seeds, prompting the use of flotation techniques. This method separates organic materials by floating them for recovery, aided by cloth filters. Dating of remains relies on analyzing the carbon-12 and decaying carbon-14 isotopes ratio. Corrections consider carbon isotope ratios in tree rings. Transition to farming was gradual, spanning thousands of years. Early evidence comes from Richard McNeish's excavations in Mexico's Tahutian Valley, showcasing the slow transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer. He excavated 12 sites and uncovered 12,000 years of agricultural history in the area. Initially, the people lived on wild plant food and small animals such as jackrabbits, deer, peccary, and lizards. They collected plant foods on a scheduled round of annual activities. About 9,000 years ago, game became more scarce, and the people began to shift more of their energy into the collection of wild plants, including squashes, chili peppers, and avocados. They scattered in small foraging groups during the dry season and came together during seasons of plenty. They may have begun the sporadic cultivation of wild plants during this period, but the efforts was minimal. Over the next 5,000 years, the people of the Tahukan Valley gradually increased their use of domesticated plants such that by 7,000 years before present, about 10% of their diet came from cultivated plants. They were outside the original area of domestication, but by this time were growing a large group of presumably introduced crops including maize, amaranth, beans, squashes, and chilies. The maize ears were only about the size of a pencil eraser, but the plants now existed in its modern form. The dog appeared about 5,000 years ago. As time went on, people continued to devote more and more effort to farming, and by the 3,000 years before present, the majority of their food came from domesticated sources, with maize being grown along with avocados, amaranth, squash, and cotton. Turkeys were domesticated about 2,000 years ago. Similar evidence of transitions from hunters to farmers can be found in numerous locations across the Near East. One such site is Jericho in the Jordan Valley, where a continuous record of 9,000 years of habitation was left as people built new mud huts on top of others as they deteriorated over time. In the earliest period, the settlement consisted of Natufians who were primarily hunters of gazelles and foxes and who tended a few cereals but had no domestic animals. About 9,000 years ago, they began to raise cereals in earnest, and there is the first evidence that sheep and goats were being domesticated. A similar long-term record of successive settlement is recorded at Catalhoic, Turkey, where people were initially foragers who raised a few cereals on the side, but by 10,000 years before present had domesticated cattle and were large-scale farmers. Now let us talk about origins of crops. Almost all of our major crops had been domesticated by 5,000 years before present, with the earliest grains and legumes appearing in the northeast over 10,000 years ago. The first crops were as diverse as the people and the places where agriculture began. Different native plant assemblages were located in each of the early farming areas, and as a result, variant plant and animal species were domesticated in each of them. In the Middle East, there were huge natural stands of wheat and barley, and as a result, the early farmers in this region exploited these as their staple crops. In Southeast Asia, wheat and barley were absent, but large grained rice was plentiful, and as a result, rice became one of the crops of choice. Wheat, barley, and rice were not present in Mesoamerica and Africa, so people exploited the locally abundant monocotyledons, sorghum in Africa and maize in Mesoamerica. No large grained species of any kind existed in South America, and as a result, the early farmers there domesticated the tuberous species such as potato, sweet potato, and cassava, and the pseudo grains chinopod and amaranth. Starchy staples were among the first domesticants at all the centers of crop origins, but they were also complemented with a high protein vegetable and fiber crop. Vegetables in the legume family were domesticated in all the major regions, including cowpea in Africa, soybean in China, groundnut in South America, lentil and chickpea in the Near East. Amaranth and chinopod were also very important sources of vegetable protein in the New World. Fiber was provided by different cotton species in Africa and South America, flax in the Near East and hemp in China. To the core group of crops in each region, additional leafy vegetables, spices, oil crops, and fruits were gradually added. Among the last group of plants to be domesticated were the fruits. While the grape and fig are very ancient and may have been cultivated for 10,000 years, most of our other woody fruit crops were among the last additions to farming. This may be due in part to tree fruits taking so long to mature, since after planting the farmer must wait 5 to 10 years for a harvest. In addition, the fruit crops are outcrossed species whose seedlings would frequently be inferior to the mother plant due to cross pollination. Complex pruning and grafting techniques had to be developed to fully exploit their potential. Now, dear students, let us talk about characteristics of early domesticants. Among the earliest crops, 3 were grain in the gramineae, that is barley, rice and wheat. 2 were fleshy tubers in convolvulaceae, that is sweet potato, and diascoraceae, that is yams. 4 were seeds in the leguminaceae, that is chickpea, garden pea, lentil and common bean, and 2 were fruits in the solanaceae, that is chili and peppers, and cucurbitaceae, that is squashes and gourds. Some species like dry beans and chili peppers were domesticated multiple times, while others such as maize had more restricted origins. Early domesticants, mainly annuals capable of self-pollination, offered advantages like quick reproduction, high seed yield, and adaptability to diverse climates. Self-pollination ensured reliable reproduction and genetic consistency, while annual habit prevented pest buildup. Crop traits often derived from native progenitors, but exceptions exist like cultivated cottons from wild perennials and soybeans from outcrossers to inbreeders. The only major crop species that are not annual selfers are: first, maize, pearl millet, and quinoa, which are annual but outcrossed. Second, cassava and sugarcane, which are both outcrossed and perennial, and a number of woody fruit crops that are also both outcrossed and perennial. Maize, pearl millet, quinoa were domesticated in areas where there were few large grain grasses available, and so primitive farmers had no other option but to work with outcrossed grains. Pearl millet is not large seeded but does produce a large inflorescence. Cassava and sugarcane, though perennial outcrossers, were easily domesticated due to their ability to propagate through cuttings. Woody perennials were challenging to propagate, but their fleshy fruits offered significant rewards once mastered. Large seeded grains and tubers were primarily domesticated in savanna or Mediterranean climates characterized by long drought periods favoring plants with large annual seeds or tubers. In regions with extreme cold, large seeds remain dormant in winter and germinate when temperatures rise in spring, as observed in some grains in eastern North America. Let us now talk about changes during the domestication process. Once plants were domesticated, they were dramatically altered by humans through both conscious and unconscious selection. Simmons has made the point in his book on principles of crop improvement that probably the total genetic change achieved by farmers over the last 9,000 years was far greater than that of scientific breeders in the last 100 years. At early stages in the domestication process, a number of changes began to appear in the genetic and physiological makeup of many crop species. Some of these changes were due to conscious selection, such as increases in palatability and color, but many of the others were the unconscious byproduct of planting and harvesting. Harlan recognized a whole syndrome of traits associated with inadvertent selection due to the broadcasting and harvesting of grain crops. Domestications of other broadcast seed crops such as legumes produced similar patterns. Harvesting resulted in the selection of the non-shattering trait, more determinate growth, more uniform ripening, and increased seed production. All of these characteristics would have increased the likelihood that the seed of a genotype would be collected and subsequently planted. Other characteristics associated with enhanced harvests would be selection towards erect types with synchronous tillering and an increase in the size of inflorescences, number of fertile florets per inflorescence, and the number of inflorescences. Seedling competition caused by planting in close proximity probably increased seedling vigor and rate of germination, as individuals with these characteristics would have been most likely to win the race to reproductive age. Under natural conditions, plants would have evolved a delay in germination from seed maturation until favorable conditions the next growing season. Also, prolonged seed dormancy would guarantee that at least a few seeds would be available to germinate after prolonged stretches of suboptimal weather. Once seeds were harvested and stored away from the natural environment, these adaptations were no longer necessary. Greater seed size probably contributed to seedling vigor, and a loss of germination inhibitors would have allowed faster germination. Thin seed coats also evolved under domestication, as a reduced seed coat is more permeable to water and the result in more rapid germination. Of course, not all crop domestications followed the same evolutionary path as the broadcast grains and legumes. In those crops harvested for some plant part other than seeds, increases in seed size would have been much more modest than in the legumes and grains, as humans selected genotypes partitioning more energy into larger leaves or tubers. In the seeded crops like lettuce and radish, non-dehiscence and high fertility would have remained important. But among the vegetatively propagated crops, the ability to sexually reproduce would have been far less critical. In fact, many vegetatively propagated lines of taro, banana, and potato cannot sexually reproduce at all. These genotypes presumably devote more energy into their harvested parts than sexually reproducing ones, and in the case of banana, there may even have been human selection against hard, flinty seeds. Sometimes the primary reason for domestication changed as humans began to consciously improve a crop. Squashes and pumpkins started out with small fruits and bitter flesh. They may have first been used as rattles in ceremonies and dances, as dishes, and as storage vessels. Only much later were they used as food, first for their seeds and then for their flesh. Other crops that came to have multiple uses include flax, that is for oil and fiber, hemp, also for oil, fiber and stimulation, and chinopod, seeds and leafy vegetables. One of the most dramatic examples of a species used in multiple ways is Brassica oleracea, whose flowers came to be used as cauliflower and broccoli, while its leaves became kale, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts, and its fleshy combs became kohlrabi. As humans began to save grain seeds and plant the same field every year, local adaptations would have gradually increased over time as the highest proportion of seeds were gathered from the most vigorous individuals. Clegg studied evolutionary changes in a synthetic population of 28 worldwide barley varieties. The mixture of seeds was initially sown in a large plot in 1929 and was allowed to reproduce by natural crossing without any artificial selection, and a random sample of seeds was collected and sown annually. Over the ensuing decades, they documented dramatic changes in gene frequency, resulting in higher and more stable grain yields with more compact, heavier spikes with larger number of seeds. In summary, the shift from hunting gathering to agriculture was a prolonged and multifaceted process spanning thousands of years. The dynamics of domestication, influenced by environmental, cultural, and societal factors, led to the transformation of plants and animals to meet human needs. The conscious and unintentional selection during harvesting played a pivotal role in shaping the characteristics of early crops. The diverse origins of agriculture worldwide highlight the complex interplay of regional forces. While theories such as the oasis theory and population growth offers explanations, the prolonged delay in embracing agriculture suggests that the hunter-gatherer lifestyle provided sufficient comfort until compelling reasons arose for the adoption of farming practices. The evolution of farming marked a crucial turning point in human history, laying the foundation for the development of civilizations. So, dear students, it was all about today's lecture. I hope you have learned some fundamentals about origins of agriculture, its dynamics of domestication. See you soon with a new topic. Goodbye.